Hello and welcome friends, I'm that Happy Viking and I would like to present to you my set review of Ikoria for Gentry. If you have no idea what Gentry is, check the description below this video for more information. In this episode, we will be looking at the blue cards. First up we have Aegis Turtle, the aforementioned 0/5 for 1 mana. We are definitely going to see this card from sideboards to fight back against mono red for sure. But we might also see it if the Toughness Matters deck comes to fruition, and I think it's gotten a lot of tools here where that deck might be a scary new addition to the Gentry metagame. Anticipate is a reprint, occasionally played. The fact that you don't draw the card makes it really awkward because we have the second draw deck now that would really appreciate that. Archipelago is a 7 mana 7/7 that has mutate 6, so we get the discount. Whenever this creature mutates, tap up to X target creatures, where X is the number of times this creature has mutated. Those creatures don't untap during their controller's next untap step. So if you keep on mutating, you can keep locking down increasing number of creatures, but that puts eggs in that one basket. Blue is really good at protecting their basket though, with both negate and another spell that we're going to see very soon here. I wouldn't be surprised to see this in blue decks at some point, but I do feel there's a lot of options that are just simply better than this. Having a mutate creature that has a high base power and toughness is really interesting to combine with a bunch of other abilities though. So I find it hard to evaluate this card. Avian Oddity is a 4 mana 2/3 flying that can cycle for 3 mana. When you do, you get a flying counter on target creature you control. As an uncommon, I don't think this is interesting. There's better mutate ways to give things flying. So for 3 mana you can use Vulpiki to give a creature flying and a +1/+1 counter. It won't be at instant speed, but how many times is giving something flying at instant speed going to be very relevant? I just don't really see it happening. Boon of the Wish Giver is a 6 mana sorcery that draws you 4 cards and has cycling 1. I think that people that try to play this will often find themselves looking at that cycling 1 as a way to make this a playable card. 6 mana as a sorcery for control decks is just something that's not interesting at all. Maybe if we had a tap out blue deck, but right now that isn't really a thing in the metagame. If we still had what was it, the enchantment that milled your opponent for 2 whenever you draw a card, then this might have been a option, but currently I don't see it happening more than maybe once in a heavy blue, very slow late game focused deck. Otherwise there's just way better options for this, definitely at uncommon. Capture Sphere is a reprint, 4 mana flash aura. When enchanted, when a Capture Sphere enters the battlefield, tap enchanted creature and it doesn't untap during its controller's unstep step. So this is blue's way of exiling things. Usually blue is paired with colors that fix their removal problem, so that this is hardly ever necessary. The effect is pretty expensive as well, so I don't think we'll suddenly see it played. Convolute is back as a counterspell that counters a target spell unless its controller pays 4 for 3 mana. At 3 mana you get a hard counter spell, so it's easier on your colors, but that's not really that interesting. Crustacean or Crustacean is a 4 mana 1/6 flash I don't think this is playable. Even for the Toughness Matters decks, you will not want to pay 4 mana just to get a 1/6 on the battlefield. Dreamtail Heron is a 5 mana 3/4 flying, mutates for 4, so here we have the discount again, and whenever this creature mutates, draw a card. At common, this is Vulpikeet levels of enabling for the good mutate decks. This card will get played for sure, or should get played, as it mitigates the disadvantage that mutate has, where you are putting multiple of your cards onto one permanent for your opponent to interact with, but this has already given you so much extra. Having 3/4 as its base power and toughness is really impressive as well, and gives flying. So you give evasion to a creature that might have a really interesting ability on whenever it deals damage or anything like that. So yeah, really strong card. Definitely expect to see it play. I'm actually surprised this was printed as common. I totally thought it was an uncommon when I saw it in the spoilers. Escape Protocol is a 2 mana enchantment. Whenever you cycle a card, you may pay 1. When you do, exile target artifact or creature you control, then return it to the battlefield under its owner's control. So this is Astral Slide with a cost attached to it, but we have cheaper cycling right now. I do expect Flicker, so blinking, flickering, whatever you want to call it, the exile and return, to be a deck in the future, using probably this as a repeatable way to blink something and thus creating a soft lock for your opponents. I'm not sure if we have the enters the battlefield trigger creatures at this point that you really want to be cycling, but if we don't have it now, we will have it in the near future. This card will get played. I'm just not sure if it's going to be straight away. And we get 2 of the best blue cards in one screen here for the set. Essence Scatter, 2 mana, counter target creature spell, has been the tool that control decks have been missing since September to really make a fist in the current metagame. All the blue decks currently are forced to play this weird tempo game because they don't have this strong late game presence where they're threatening to just straight up knock down everything without losing too much tempo in the early game. Very big deal. It's going to cause a lot of frustration for non-control players, and it's going to be a huge staple for all the control players. Facet Reader, 2 mana 1/2 human wizards, draw a card and discard. Pretty much irrelevant. It's just too frail, too slow, takes an activation cost, and there's, even if it really matters for your deck to draw cards constantly, like the second draw and like some other cards we're going to see a bit later, then I feel like for Gentry this is just too slow a card. Could somebody prove me wrong? Maybe, because it is a really interesting card to even have main deck that will improve your matchup against mono red. So it does that, and if it synergizes well enough with the rest of your deck, then maybe. Frostlings is a reprint. We have it now. It's occasionally played in blue aggro decks and elemental decks, and it will stay there. With Mutate entering the fray, its stock goes slightly up because there will be more people investing a lot in one single permanent rather than diversifying their threats. Frostveil Ambush, 5 mana, instant to tap 2 creatures. Those don't untap during their control's next untap step, but the most important part, cycling 1. With all the cycling enablers and especially the aforementioned enchantment, that blinks whenever you cycle. Cycling one card will be looked at more closely, and having this effect on a card that has a expensive effect that might win you game state in the late game is just great. So if the cycling deck becomes a thing, I expect Frostveil Ambush to be in it. Glimmerbell is just waiting for an aura that lets it tap to do something crazy. Otherwise, I don't think this will see any play. Gust of Wind is a 4-mana sorcery. This spell costs 2 less to cast if you control a creature with flying. It returns a non-land permanent you don't control to its owner's hand, and you draw a card. At this point, like I said before, most blue decks are rather aggressive, tempo-oriented decks that usually aim to have a very scary threat that they protect, or aim to control the tempo of the game, so their somewhat mediocre aggro options can take over a game. In that second type of deck, this kind of card is really good, because usually they are focused on flying creatures as well, so they don't need to worry about your creatures with summoning sickness being able to block. And playing the tempo game with bounce and drawing extra cards is really strong in these decks. Definitely going to see play. Hampering Snare, 2 mana. Your creatures your opponent control get -2, -0 with cycling, but cycling 2. The main effect is underwhelming, and cycling 2, we can just do better than that. I don't expect to see it in Gentry. Keep Safe, counter target spell that targets a permanent you control, draw a card for 2 mana. So like we said before, there's 2 kinds of blue aggro decks. One tries to control the tempo, the other one tries to get a big finisher on board and protect it. This is where I count the Crackling Drake decks, for example, but also the Staggering Insight Fairy Vandal decks. And these decks will definitely be playing between 2 or up to 4 keep safes in their deck. So a very big card for those kinds of decks, and I wouldn't be surprised to see it appear left and right in blue decks, just as a different kind of negate for them. Mystic Subdual is a 2-mana aura with flash. Enchanted creature gets -2, -0 and loses all abilities. That's a really strong effect to have, but at uncommon you probably want to have something else, something better. There's not many blue decks that don't have another way of dealing with opposing creatures that you need to be playing this. One of the things I do think of is really problematic recurring creatures like God Eternal Kefnet. Throwing this on there might be really interesting to lock it down. But other than that, I don't really expect to see it played, because you can have more permanent answers to problematic creatures of your opponent than this. Mythos or Mythos of Illuna is a 4-mana sorcery that creates a token that's a copy of target permanent. If red and green was spent to cast this spell, instead create a token that's a copy of that permanent, except the token... Geez, that's too many accepts. Instead, and then except. Exact the token has when this permanent enters the battlefield. If it's a creature, it fights up to 1 target creature you don't control. I would never play this in Gentry. It relies on either your opponent to have a really awesome thing or you to have it. So either your opponent has something problematic in play already that you have to deal with, or you have something problematic in play, and then you're usually better off just making sure to protect that and trying to cast a sorcery that wraps up your mana into it isn't really the plan there. The upside of red and green is that if it's a creature then it fights is another restriction in making this really worth it, not really a bonus, because then it's only good in the scenario where there's a creature that is better than what your opponent already has on the board, and then you'll be able to take care of that. But either it's a make a status quo if your opponent is way ahead, or it's a win more if you're ahead. So I just don't see this as being that interesting. Neutralizes a 3 mana instant counterspell. Obviously it's an instant with cycling. We have a bunch of it's an uncommon, that's the big problem here. We have a bunch of common 3 mana counter target spells that mill 3 now. So if you really need to get that cycling as an enabler, I might see people play this. But I wouldn't be surprised to see that those decks are really strapped on their uncommon slots already. So because all the good enter the battlefield creatures are pretty much uncommons or even rares. And the enchantment is an uncommon. So I don't think it will be played that much. But I wouldn't be surprised if it does find like 1 or 2 slots that it can jump in for that extra flexibility. Of One Mind is a 3 mana sorcery that costs 2 less to cast if you control a human creature and a non-human creature. Draws you 2 cards and is a common. This is the first card I think we see that refers to the other theme of Ikoria, is cards that have a payoff if you have a human and a non-human creature. If you do, obviously the spell is insane. If you don't, it's slow but somewhat decent. Currently the decks, there are not really decks that are focusing on this. And besides getting 2 cards, it doesn't really help you out that much. Like the draw 2 decks only need to have 1 card drawn at sorcery speed. So if a new deck emerges that can take advantage of the creature type, then this might be in there, but I suspect those decks will be focusing on other colors. Ominous Seas. This is not Omen of the Sea, this is Ominous Seas. Completely different card. It's a 2 mana enchantment. Wait, that's Omen of the Sea is one as well. Whatever. Whenever you draw a card, put a foreshadow counter on Ominous Seas. Remove 8 foreshadow counters, create an 8/8 blue Kraken creature token, and it has cycling. Okay. So a lot of people have asked me already if I think that this card is going to break Gentry, and to be completely honest, I don't think so. There is 2 homes for this deck. One is blue-red spells, which is constantly trying to draw cards because it just makes their Crackling Drakes and their Improbable Alliance better. But that also means that this needs to take the place of either a Fairy Vandal, an Ominous, an Improbable Alliance, or a Crackling Drake, which are also all uncommons. So I don't think it's going to be played in that deck. Where I do think it might be played in is those hard blue control decks that are now enabled by Essence Scatter that want a late game recurring threat, because you don't need to sacrifice this to create that 8/8 token. You can make a second one and a third one eventually, and I wouldn't be surprised to see it played there. Now once we hit post rotation and blue-red spells loses their Crackling Drake, then maybe this card can slot in there then, but who knows what we'll have by then. Phase Dolphin is next for a 3 mana 1/4. Whenever it attacks, another target attacking creature can't be blocked this turn. So we mentioned the Toughness Matters deck that might become viable already. I don't think this is good enough for that deck. There's a lot of other better options that you have. This one needs to attack itself already. It's very telegraphed. People know what's coming next turn. So I'd rather have effects that have an impact when you play it, so your opponent is more on their toes about what exactly is going to come. Polywog Symbiote. Each creature spell you cast costs 1 less to cast if it has Mutate. Whenever you cast a creature spell, if it has Mutate, draw a card, then discard a card. Mutate Enabler. We already saw the Heron that draws you a card whenever it mutates. So a blue focused mutate deck will most likely try to fit this in. It is uncommon though, and it's only card selection. I'm not sure if this is going to be enough to fit it in, especially considering the fact that it's uncommon, but I wouldn't be surprised to see it. So people that are building that deck should take a hard look at Polywog Symbiote. At 1/3, it even has a pretty decent body to stand against some of the first attacks of aggro decks, so keep that in mind as well. And we get Bouncing Shore Shark, 5 mana 4/3, but mutate 4. And Flash, and whenever it mutates, you may return target creature an opponent controls to its owner's hand. So this, together with the Heron, are the two big Gentry relevant mutate cards in blue. Constantly threatening that bounce plus a 4/3 Flash creature really puts a lot of stress on your opponents. There's a lot of decks in Gentry currently that really try to make one big threat and live off of that, be it a Crackling Drake, be it a Ajani's Pridemate, be it a Fairy Vandal that's gone out of hand with Staggering Insight. So this double threatens those in a very, very strong way. Reconnaissance Mission, 4 mana. Whenever a creature you control deals combat to a player, you may draw a card. Has cycling 2 as well. A very strong effect, but it requires a bit of setup. So you want a lot of creatures that are likely hard to block, and you have to keep in mind that you are investing into those abilities. So that means you won't be doing a lot of damage in the meantime, but you will have an easier time doing the damage. You also need to take into account that the turn you play this, if it resolves, you won't be impacting the board whatsoever. So I see maybe a mono blue aggro deck trying to play this, but they'll need to dedicate a lot of cards to locking down your opponent to enable that this card advantage turns into a win afterwards. So we saw the 5 mana tap down 2 things down. So, and that might make this interesting. So it requires a lot of things to go well for you, but if you're playing mono blue flyers already, this could just be exactly that tool that the deck needs. So I do expect people to try this card out and get there. Last thing about the Bouncing Shore Shark, the Flash and Mutate, it does work together, so you can flash the Bouncing Shore Shark in mutating something and bouncing a creature an opponent controls to their hand, making this a huge blowout in combat situations. Sea Dasher Octopus is a 3 mana 2/2 that mutates for 2. Also has Flash, so again we have that Flash Mutate combo. Whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. Really interesting to have on a Flash Mutate creature, because you're most likely guaranteed to get that first card draw if you play the card a little bit smart. A lot of the mutate creatures that you want to be playing, like the Vulpikeet, like the Heron, give evasion, give flying, so it'll be easier to draw more cards off this card. And barring power level, because as a rare it doesn't have that much power level, it has really nice utility, but barring power level, this is definitely a card I would be looking at for that deck. Shark Typhoon or Sharknado. Enchantment for 6 mana. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, create an XX blue shark creature token with flying, where X is that spell's converted mana cost. It also has cycling X and 2. When you cycle it, create a XX blue shark creature token with flying. So worst case scenario, this draws you a card and makes you a flying chump blocker. That's a pretty good worst case scenario. Well, no, the worst case scenario is X is 0, but at that point you're probably dead in the water anyway. So let's just say the worst case scenario is a 1/1 flyer that draws you a card and is in instant speed flash jump blocker. That will be pretty good. Also having a permanent that will turn every draw spell, every counter spell you play into a moderately sized creature sounds pretty good as well. So I do expect Shark Typhoon to pop up in the kind of slow grind, super late game blue deck that I do expect to emerge again with Essence Scatter being back in the format. Startling Development. Until end of turn, target creature becomes a blue serpent with base power and toughness 4/4 with cycling 1, and it is a common. So the same comment as before. This card will get looked at in cycling enabled decks because it has cycling 1, and the effect it has might be relevant at some point. Creatures that have a on-hit ability would really benefit from this. Any creatures that have +1/+1 counters can really benefit from the sudden boost. So there's a lot of little tricks you can do for very little cost, and if that cycling is also going to be impactful in your deck, you're probably looking at a card that you want to play. Thieving Otter, 3 mana, 2/2. This is the first of the others. Whenever Thieving Otter deals damage to an opponent, draw a card. We already mentioned that the blue mutate deck has ways of giving evasion to creatures, so sticking this on your 3/4 flying heron, it even sequences correctly as a 3-drop into a 4-point mutate that then draws you a card and then draws you another card because you're hitting, because suddenly it has flying. Seems decent, but I don't know if it's strong enough, if you need something else to be that base for the mutates. So probably one of the cards you start off with when you begin designing the deck, likely one of the cards you end up cutting because you just need to be more streamlined. Voracious Great Shark is a 5 mana 5/4 flash. When it enters the battlefield, counter target artifact or creature spell. We mentioned those super late game blue decks already. They might want something like this. The blink decks might definitely want something like this, and even some of those tempo blue decks could use this. The Staggering Insight Vandal deck that I'm playing is currently playing Thrix, but I will instantly replace that Thrix for Voracious Great Shark. So I am expecting to see it, and it's going to be that highlight reel, huge blowout. Somebody thinks they're doing a comeback and you're like, nope. And I just have enough power now to swing and finish the game with you. Totally expect this to be played. Wingful Terran, 6 mana for a 3/6 dinosaur that when it enters the battlefield either gets a flying or a hexproof counter. Not worth it. Too late game focused, no options in the early game, even though it's a nice base to mutate onto, it's just not worth it. Wingspan Mentor, when it enters the battlefield, put a flying counter on target non-human creature you control. 3 mana tap, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control with flying. The weird stress that these cards have, and this one in particular, is that on the one hand, this wants to be played with a bunch of creatures that already have flying, but then it enters the battlefield, ability becomes less relevant. So I also think that it might just be too slow to really be relevant, because as we mentioned before, the decks that will have a lot of flying will usually be those that invest into flying in a way that limits how fast they're outputting damage. So that's going to be a deterrent to that strategy. On the other hand, you can also go all in, play all the 1 mana flyings, ignore the fact that it has an enters the battlefield ability, and just boost 3 turns in a row while keeping up tempo oriented counter spells, and go for the win that way. So a lot of cards in blue for Gentry, a lot of strategy. We have different control decks getting a boost, the tempo decks getting a boost, the toughness matters deck getting a boost. We have possibility for going for a blink deck, and there's just so much going on in blue for Gentry, and it's already the most popular color as we saw at the Gentry Open. If you liked the video you just saw, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe, and check out the other episodes in this set review.